Good afternoon. So, today we're going to be discussing Abu al-Walid Muhammad ibn Ahmad ibn Rushd, philosopher of Cordoba. And the text you'll be dealing with, I think, is the translation by George Hourani, the translation entitled On the Harmony of Philosophy and Religion. The full, actually, title of the work by Ibn Rushd himself is The Decisive Treatise Determining the Nature of the Connection Between Philosophy and Religion. Of course, the title was in Arabic. كتاب فصل المقال وتقرير ما بين الشريعة والحكمة من اتصال, or حكمة والشريعة من اتصال. And if you notice, if you're, I'm sorry if your Arabic isn't, don't worry, I'll translate. The actual Arabic title doesn't speak of philosophy and religion. It speaks of hikmah and sharia. It speaks of religious law and wisdom. And it's a delicate distinction, but it's an important distinction, I think. And as I hope will come across more clearly through today's presentation here with you. So, what I will be aiming to do here, as I have it set there, by the way, I'm sorry, there's meant to be a picture of Ibn Rushd, but I think he was camera shy, so I don't know why. We ended up with no picture. So what I'll aim to do here with you today is, first I'm going to start off with a brief, hopefully brief, kind of interlude or interjection, just to say something about the history of the presence of philosophy, understood here as Greek philosophy, as the Hellenic tradition, in the Arab Islamic world, from way before Ibn Rushd and all the way up to the Andalus of his time. And I think that's a very important contextualizing note to see where he's coming from in his work. Then I'll move to say more about the very content, of course, of the work, and what he's proposing here in terms of the role and place of philosophy in an Islamic monotheistic context. And I insist on this. What Ibn Rushd will be doing in this work is not presenting his philosophy. This isn't Ibn Rushd's philosophical work. Rather, this is Ibn Rushd's defense, if you wish, or argument for the role and place of philosophy in an Islamic context. Good? Which I hope, again, will be clear as we move on. So, as I said, first and foremost, I'm going to ask you to indulge me with a little digression. And we're going to rewind quite a few hundred years before Ibn Rushd and say something about the entry of Philosopher, or Greek philosophy, which was then transliterated or Arabized into the Arabic term Philosopher, into the Islamic world. And of course, with all of these things, it's always very difficult to say, oh, look, here's where it came in, the year 800. More or less, however, it's in the 800s, right? And more or less, it's in 8th century, 9th century, late 8th century, early 9th century Baghdad in particular. Of course, nothing comes out of a vacuum. It's not like people woke up one day and said, oh yeah, why not? Let's do philosophy. There's already been a sequence of events kind of happening and perhaps culminating in this kind of, what's the word I'm looking for? Kind of expansion of the interest in philosophical thought in that era and area both. And when I say philosophical thought here, and when Ibn Rushd says it, we don't only mean philosophy in the abstract metaphysical sense. That is one aspect of philosophy, but of course the sciences are also there, the natural philosophy, i.e. is there, political philosophy, and all of that. Generally, we say that the entry of philosophy, i.e. Greek philosophy, into the Arab Islamic world came through translation movements. And we have a lot of records of these early translation movements, transmission, naql, right, and translation. But then something develops, more than just translation and transmission, at a certain time in Baghdad, under the rule of Al-Ma'mun, who is the son of Harun al-Rashid. Around the 9th century, we have a great development of interest in philosophy and the sciences. These are they're not necessarily all illustrations from the era, but they certainly capture the era. And so what you have is a great rising interest in the study and translation of these Greek works translated into Arabic, most often, well, at least at the beginning, through Syriac. And you have the introduction of a lot of the works of Aristotle, certainly. Some of the works of Plato, but a lot of the works of Aristotle, and I believe in this course you've already read both Plato and Aristotle, or also a lot of the works of Plotinus and Galen, and so a lot of the medicine, the philosophy, the sciences. And what you have here is kind of illustrations. So for instance, when I say philosophy also means sciences, you have here marine biology, and of course you have astronomy / astrology. The distinction between the two may not have been too clear at the time. And of course, the mathematical sciences and the geographical sciences, and of course, metaphysics and the various sciences. And most of this took place, historically we reference Bayt al-Hikmah in Baghdad, which is kind of, if you wish, a library, but so, more than that, and less than that perhaps in different ways, where much of the debate happened and much of the early translators, say for instance with the Al-Kindi circle would meet, and supposedly Al-Ma'mun would also meet with them every Tuesday to discuss various issues. So in brief, what you have is, through this kind of movement, a natural coexistence, if you wish, arose between kind of Islamic thought and teachings and falsafa on the other hand, and sometimes expressing itself actually in certain schools of theology as well, schools of kalam, for instance. Usually the Mu'tazila are mostly referenced in that regard. But then with certain developments, both political and social, the tide slowly starts to change against, or in reference to philosophy. So you go from this very clear and solid patronage by the courts, right? I mean, I say Al-Ma'mun, he's a seventh caliph, Abbasid caliph, so he himself is a kind of patron to these arts and sciences, if you wish. So you go from this very much state sponsored, if you wish, study and interest and research and translation and whatnot, to actually the opposite. Where you have a state-centered opposition to the study of philosophy, brought on by, again, various factors, which I think are too overlapping and numerous to go into. But it is essentially a move, if you're familiar a bit with the background on Ilm al-Kalam, maybe just, kind of a shift from being very much pro the Mu'tazila to being pro the Ash'arites at the time. And so you have a certain sense of antagonism that arises towards towards philosophy, which many have taken to be best exemplified by the works of course, Abu Hamid al-Ghazali, a figure who will factor very much in the thinking and works of Ibn Rushd, as you will see in the work you're reading. He's actually, in more than one place, he literally names Abu Hamid. He directs himself to talk to, Ya Abu Hamid, Ya Habibi, right, kind of thing. Now, of course, to suggest that Al-Ghazali and the Ash'arite movement brought an end to philosophy in that general sense, that's, I keep the question mark there always. That's debatable to say the least. But I think what can be said is that there's certainly a clear attack on falsafa, right, not philosophy. And I want to just say a quick word distinguishing the two. Right? When we say that with Al-Ghazali and the Ash'arites you have the defeat or the antagonism and defeat of philosophy, now I think that's too broad, philosophy in that general sense, because Al-Ghazali himself uses philosophical tools very clearly, and the Ash'arites actually adopted many philosophical tools. And after this period into the 11th century, 12th century, you see a lot of kind of overlap between the methods of kalam, ilm al-kalam, or what we call Islamic theology, and the methods of the falasifa. But is it an attack and defeat of falsafa, which is more or less a kind of a distinct school of thought in that epoch, in that area? Many scholars would suggest so, right? So the school of thought exemplified by people like Al-Farabi and Ibn Sina, who are explicitly named and attacked by Al-Ghazali in his work, right? Al-Munqidh min al-Dalal. So, in some sense, at least one can, I think, comfortably say, well, if we mean by falsafa that school of thought represented by those authors and figures, did that lose ground in Baghdad after Al-Ghazali? Certainly. Not necessarily philosophy in the more absolute sense, though. All right, so much for the East, or at least what we're calling here the Arab East, i.e., Baghdad and this kind of Bilad al-Sham area. In the West, in the Arab Islamic West, i.e. North Africa and Spain, Al-Andalus, a slightly different story, but in some sense echoing certain events here, was also unfolding. So the remnants of the Umayyad dynasty who had taken refuge in Al-Andalus and set themselves up as a separate state, and then at one point declared themselves also a caliphate, they had a kind of general, again, patronage and support of the arts and sciences, very similar to what you saw happening in Baghdad under al-Ma'mun, for instance. And in fact, there was almost like a rivalry. And so a lot of the books were ordered to be translated and imported into Cordoba. And, Cordoba had its heyday and great golden age, very much like Baghdad in its heights. In fact, they established an equivalent to Bayt al-Hikmah, and it is reported that they had over 400,000 manuscripts brought in, translated, and studied. And so it was a very much a golden age. But of course, as I guess, I don't want to say inevitable, but maybe this is kind of historical. If only you were reading Ibn Khaldun later on. At some point, the tide changes, and it moves against, again, the Philosopher with the coming on of the Murabitun dynasty. And then even with the Muwahhidun dynasty, at least externally, again, they were very conservative, very mainstream theology. But there was something very interesting about this latter dynasty, which came onto the scene late in the 11th, 12th century, is that although outwardly they exercised a mainstream conservative kind of theology and Sharia, the rulers were actually interested in philosophy and were interested in the sciences, and so they actually encouraged it in the courts, but not outside of the courts, right? And they had a kind of, if you wish, this set of scouts that would attract and bring in various great figures of the area. And one of those scouts was, I don't know if you've heard of him, Ibn Tufayl. Any of you heard of Ibn Tufayl? No? A lovely figure who wrote Hayy ibn Yaqzan. And he was actually the one who, kind of brought in, if you wish, Ibn Rushd to the court of the time. And for many years there, with Ibn Rushd, with Ibn Tufayl, with Ibn Baja before them both, there was again a flourishing of the study of philosophy and the various sciences in what we're referencing here as the western part of the Arab Islamic world, i.e. Andalus and North Africa. But again, for whatever reason, that changed at one point towards the end of Ibn Rushd's life. Right, so that's, I think, a good enough digression, a good enough kind of interjection to help you see that this is where Ibn Rushd is basically coming from, and this is where he's writing from, with all this in mind, right? The various backs and forth, the various antagonisms between the schools of philosophy, the representatives of the rational schools, and the representatives of the more traditional kind of mainstream schools. And it was a huge issue for him, as you'll see in the tone of the text he's using, because this didn't, this wasn't simply something that was happening at the level of debate, let's agree to disagree. I mean, the results of this were bloodshed at many points. The results of this were takfir, right? And the results of this were, what is called the mihna. Phenomenal. Okay? Of course, the suggestion, of course, that at any certain point there was a homogeneous kind of either fully pro-philosophy or fully anti-philosophy is, of course, would be a ridiculous and false oversimplification. At the time of the patronage of the philosophers in Baghdad, there was the anti-philosophers, there was those who stood against it and were prosecuted for it, such as Ahmad ibn Hanbal. And at the time of the heights of traditionalism and mainstream kind of theology, there was, of course, the proponents of philosophy who were also themselves persecuted. For a long time, Andalus was much kind of calmer. There was a coexistence, sure. Those who want to insist on the premise or the centrality of philosophy, let them. And those who want to be more traditionalist, fine, let them, right? So with that in mind, we come to who Ibn Rushd is and the text he's writing. And as I said, all this kind of background I gave you, keep it in mind, because when he's writing this text, the decisive treatise determining the nature of the connection between philosophy and religion, between wisdom and religious law, he has all of this kind of history in mind, this dark history, and you'll see that tone coming up in his text. All right, so very, very briefly, biography. These days you can find all of this, much more than this online. So just basically he comes from a very prominent family in his times in Cordoba, from a family of jurists who had a very good social standing. And he studied Maliki law and Ash'ari kalam, and he studied, of course, philosophy and medicine and geometry and the various sciences. He was really what we call a polymath, right? Very much so. And then, as I mentioned earlier, he was invited by Ibn Tufayl to join the court of the intellectuals at the court of the caliph at the time, the ruler, and he was happy to do so. And Abu Yaqub Yusuf was basically the ruler of the time, was, as I said, himself very much interested in the study of philosophy, but he found Aristotle rather difficult. And he had originally asked Ibn Tufayl to write a commentary on Aristotle's work, but Ibn Tufayl was very busy writing his great phenomenal work, Hayy ibn Yaqdan. And so he suggested that Ibn Rushd actually do this. And one of those great moments of accidents of human history. Because of these commentaries that Ibn Rushd writes on Aristotle and the many, many other commentaries that he then writes, he gains the nickname, the commentator on Aristotle. Beyond philosophy and science and medicine, it's very important, I think, to keep in mind that he also served as a judge, as a qadi. And here, qadi is not a civic judge, right? It's a religious position. And then as qadi qudat, high chief judge of Cordoba for a long while. He was also, of course, doctor to the ruler of the time. And so in many ways you can think of Ibn Rushd, the person, as representing this kind of coming together of medicine, science, philosophy, sharia, right? Law, religious law, all in one person. And in some sense he represents this connection between philosophy and religion that he entitles his works on and speaks of. He wrote obviously profusely, don't need to say all the things he wrote or didn't write, sorry. One thing of interest I find about his writings is actually he's one of the first to suggest certain modifications to Ptolemy's theory, if you're familiar with the cosmology and the theory of the universe proposed by people like Ptolemy. So he was very much in all kind of aspects of natural science and philosophy. He fell from grace, as I mentioned earlier, in 1195. There seems to have been a shift again in the attitude towards philosophy. Many stories of what happened there. I like anecdotes, so I'll share one of them. So apparently it had been brought to the attention of the ruler that in one of his books, Ibn Rushd has written in the margin, referencing Venus, that she was a goddess. Right? And of course, with the Romans, she was. And this really angered the Muslim theologians, that he would reference Venus as a goddess, and so apparently that placed a lot of pressure on the ruling elite to stop supporting him. He exiled himself and died in exile. Though he was pardoned later and allowed to return, he chose not to return. So haram. But his body was brought back to Cordoba 3 months after its burial, and it was buried in Cordoba, and there's a whole plaza dedicated to him and his big statues and others, of course, of the era. Okay. So the key points, again, I just want to, before we move on, is in this biography, I want you again to emphasize this notion that he is a judge, he is a philosopher, as much as he is a doctor, a scientist, right? And these aspects, I think, are very important to keep in mind when you're reading this text that you have in hand, particularly his legal background, particularly the fact that he is chief judge. Because at least from my readings, and feel free to disagree and debate this in your discussion sessions, he approaches this work here, the decisive treatise, not as the philosopher, but as the jurist, as the qadi. And he wants to pass, if you wish, a verdict. The verdict in relation to the connection, if any, right, between philosophical investigation or philosophy or hikmah and religion and sharia on the other hand. So the question that moves the work is that, what is, and it's asked by a jurist here, what is the attitude, what is the position of the religious law as regards philosophy? Right? In other words, does it allow it? Does it forbid it? Or does it encourage it? Or maybe command it? Right? These are the various possible attitudes religious law can have to anything. Either it allows something, or it forbids it, or it commands it. Right? So he proposes that question. And that's the central question for Ibn Rushd. Because if we can show, for instance, that religious law forbids the study of philosophy, then done. Khalas. Right? End of discussion. Why do we keep coming back and forth and debates and burning of books and persecution of figures? So it's a very legal question. And he begins his response with the following statement. If, and the if here has a really interesting place, the Arabic idha, right? Because it could be taken as a hypothetical, but actually it can be taken as given that, right? So it could be premising, and it could be if, right? But it's more of the premising here. So he says, if the activity of philosophy is nothing more than the study of existing beings and reflection upon them as indications of the artisan, of the creator, and if the law has encouraged and urged reflection on beings, right, note the two levels for encouraged, urged, urging of course is higher, then it is clear that what this name signifies, i.e. philosophy, is either obligatory or recommended by law. And law here means religious law, right, not civic law. Okay? So the question is very simply this for him. If this is what philosophy does, and if what philosophy does is something encouraged or commanded by religious law, then clearly, right, basic logic, the law commands the study of philosophy. Right? So we want to show whether this is an argument that follows, whether this argument actually works. So Ibn Rushd begins with the second statement. If the law has encouraged and urged religious law, right? If the law has encouraged and urged us to reflect upon being, al-makhluqat, right, and al-mawjudat, and to reflect and study them. So has religious law encouraged the believer to reflect upon beings? No? Yes? Wild guesses? Or is it one of those delicate things? I don't want to guess about this. Just tell me what he says. Of course, the answer for Ibn Rushd is a very clear and resounding yes. Absolutely. Right? He says there's plenty of examples. Remember, he's coming from that, that's what I'm saying, he's coming from that jurist background, right? There are very clear examples on revelation in the Word of God that we are expected, encouraged, and at points commanded to study and reflect upon beings, right? These are two verses he references. The first says, reflect, you have vision. And this for Ibn Rushd is an imperative, right? It's a fa'al amr. Reflect, you have vision. The second he offers is, have they not studied the kingdom of the heavens and the earth and whatever things God has created? And this kind of questioning is more kind of encouragement. In other words, we ought, right? One should study the kingdom of the heavens and the earth. And right? Why haven't we? Have we not done that? Right? Kind of thing. And there are others, of course, he also references. The main point for him is that it is clear, not because Ibn Rushd is saying so, no, this is God's word. God is clearly calling upon us to reflect upon beings. Right? To reflect upon al-wujud and al-mawjudat, both. And if you have a reference or you can show encouragement, but you can also show commandment, then the commandment takes precedence. Does that make sense? Right? So in this context of the religious law argument, if the law allows something in one place and commands it in another place, then the commandment takes precedence, not the allowing. In other words, we're commanded to reflect upon beings. Okay? Fine. شو خص philosophy? How does philosophy come into this picture? Right? So if we're commanded to reflect upon beings, well, what is reflection? Right? Ibn Rushd then says, well, reflection is nothing more than inference and drawing out the unknown from the known. Right? So you infer from what is known that which is unknown, that which you're seeking. And this is reasoning, he says. And since this is reasoning, or at any rate done by reasoning, therefore we are under an obligation to carry our study of being by intellectual reasoning. So we go from God commands us to reflect. Reflection is drawing out the unknown from the known. Drawing out the unknown from the known is either reasoning or at least done through intellectual reasoning. Therefore, we have to reflect rationally and use our reasoning. Right? And if we are to use our reasoning, like with anything, we ought to use the best form of our reasoning, which for Ibn Rushd is demonstrative reasoning, al-qiyas al-aqli. right? Which is the highest form of reasoning, at least according to the Philosopher. And of course, in doing that, we have to build on what's happened before us. We have to build on, so in other words, if anyone's done work in reflective reasoning before us, we start from them. We can't start from scratch. And according to Ibn Rushd, this is what we do with any science, with any sina'a, with any art. So what say you about the art of arts? Philosophy. وهي صنعة الصنائع. In other words, if in any of the sciences we cannot be expected to start from ground zero, right? We have to look and see what's been done before us and build on that. Then that must also be true of philosophy. So in other words, if I am now to do or to carry out my study of beings by intellectual reasoning, I have to see what's been done in the field of intellectual reasoning before me, right? And you see now we're slowly moving to the works of philosophy. Because the works of Greek philosophy, the works of those before me, in philosophy, are precisely where I find the study of intellectual reasoning, the methods of intellectual reasoning, the how, the do's and don'ts, basically the rules of logic and logical reasoning and etc. Right? Because to do intellectual reasoning, I need to understand the various forms of reasoning. Valid reasoning, invalid reasoning, what makes an argument sound, what makes an argument valid. Right? The different types of reasoning, he says. Rhetorical, dialectical, demonstrative reasoning, how to distinguish between them. And all of that has already been done. And it's been done in those books, by those predecessors of ours, from, say, for instance, the Greco-Roman tradition, right? So now if we want to capture the gist of the argument, and this is on the second page of your fly sheet in case you're following, summary of the argument basically goes as follows. So we've established that the law commands the study of beings and reflection upon them, right? And we've also established, according to Ibn Rushd, that reflection, this notion of reflection, is only possible through intellectual reasoning, the highest of which of the demonstration. So what this means then is that I have to go and study the various works written on this issue and method of intellectual demonstrative reasoning, right? Which is, by the way, most of it is found in the books of the philosophers. So that means one has to study the works of those before us who have done work in these matters, having gained the skill of intellectual reasoning and particularly demonstrative reasoning. Now I can go back and reflect and study upon beings. And again, if there's been works in reflection and study on beings using these methods done before me, then I can use them, right? Not accept them, not accept their conclusions wholesale, but use them, learn from them, the methodology. And so this means one has to study what those before us have done in this field, i.e. the study of beings through demonstrative reasoning, just like with any other field. Conclusion, the law commands the study of philosophy. Again, remember, this is religious law, right? So the law commands the study of philosophy. مأمور به على جهة الوجوب, he says. It's a must, right? Now, of course, if you jump up and say, well, hold on. So you're saying religious law is obliging me to study the works of non-monotheist, pagan heretics? Are you for real? That doesn't make sense, right? And of course, he's anticipated, you might say something like this. Of course, many had said something like this at the time. He says, there's a big difference between me studying the methods and learning their tools, on the one hand, and studying their methods and conclusions and accepting them wholesale on the other hand. I'm not saying we study these works and whatever they say we take. I'm saying there's a method of demonstrative reasoning, of intellectual reasoning, that had been, according to Ibn Rushd and many before him, perfected by Aristotle. Right? Al-Farabi says something similar, Ibn Rushd says something similar. Right? And so we take that, and we see where that leads us, but we will apply it within the rules of Islamic or within the umbrella of Islamic faith and the rules of Arabic language. Right? So yes, I will take the tool. And he gives an analogy on how borrowing the tool from someone, irrespective whether that someone is of your same religion or not, does not change the validity of the act, which I won't go into. I'll leave that for your class. From that point, he does something very, very interesting. So if the law commands the study of philosophy, he goes from the defense of the role and place of philosophy to an attack on those who want to stop me from fulfilling that commandment, right? To stop me from doing philosophy. Like Abu Hamid, yeah? Like Al-Ghazali, that's who he has in mind. He actually names him at one point. So he says, given that the law commands the study of philosophy, what follows from that is that whoever forbids the study of philosophy and philosophical books to anyone, now note this important qualification we'll address in a minute, to anyone who is fit to study philosophy, i.e. anyone who unites two qualities, natural intelligence, ذكاء الفطرة is what he calls it, and religious integrity and moral virtue, is blocking people, so whoever forbids the study is blocking people from the door by which the law summons them to the knowledge of God. And such an act is the extreme of ignorance and estrangement from God, the exalted. Right? In other words, and again, note this is a legal stance. In other words, if the law commands me to do X, whatever X is, and you are forbidding me or you are stopping me from fulfilling that commandment, you are committing an error, a grave error. Right? So if the law commands the study of philosophy, and you are stopping me from studying philosophy or accessing philosophy, then you're committing a grave error. Okay? But note now the qualification he brings in. The study of philosophy to those who are fit to study it. So now we have a different kind of qualifying note. Because when we stop here, it's a bit scary to suggest that the religious law obliges us, all the faithful, to study philosophy. تعبق شوي. I don't want to study philosophy. Right? But he says there's a commandment. What do you mean you don't want to? Well, no, it's not a commandment for everyone, says Ibn Rushd. It's a commandment for those who can, which again is a legal position. The law commands of someone whatever that someone is capable of. The law would never, or God would never, in this position here, ask of a person more than what they can do. Right? So yes, for instance, fasting is an obligation if I can. But if I can't, I can't. Or pilgrimage, or etc. Right? So if he's assuming or he's treating the study of philosophy in a similar manner, then actually the conclusion here should be the law obliges the law obliges the study of philosophy to those who can. Right? And this to those who can qualification brings in a certain classification in some sense of the intellectual capacities or in the intellectual gateways of human beings. And the way he says it is that the different people come to tasdeeq, to assent in divine truth, through different paths. 3, to be precise. Either through intellectual reasoning, and then to those this is commanded, or through dialectical reasoning, or through rhetorical. Right? And again, Ibn Rushd is saying, don't take my word for it. This is, again, something I derive from the word of God himself, where God speaks unto the prophet and says, summon to the way of your Lord by wisdom and by good preaching, and debate with them in the most effective manner. Right? For Ibn Rushd, this ayah clearly sets out 3 different ways to summon to the way of the Lord. Id'i ila sabili rabbika. Right? 3 ways. Either wisdom, or good preaching, or debate. Which for him means that people come to tasdeeq, come to the way of the Lord through one of these methods. Some follow the path of khutaba, of rhetoric, of preaching, and that's more than enough, and that's fine. Right? He's not being derogative here, he's not being pejorative and haram khutaba. No, that's one way. There's another way, which is the dialectical method, which he mostly associates with ulama al-kalam. And then there's a third way, which is intellectual reasoning, demonstrative reasoning, right? Because it's referenced here very clearly, wisdom, hikmah. And I hope now you see why he insists on using the term hikmah in the title of his work, not falsafa. Right? Because the word falsafa, of course, appears nowhere in the Holy Quran, but the word hikmah appears everywhere. Good. So there are 3 ways, and to those who can perform intellectual reasoning, demonstrative reasoning, then yes, they are obliged to. They should. Right? Mish they may, they must. Right? And to those who can't, mish they may not, they must not. Right? So much so, in fact, that he goes further and says, one should never, one of the demonstrative class, of this class of intellectual reasoning, should never put in the words of the many the truths of demonstration and speak to them. In other words, if somebody comes to someone of if I were someone of the rhetorical class and I see a philosopher, Ibn Rushd, and I say, I've been wondering, I've read this verse, and I'm trying to understand the inner meanings and whatnot, and he says, Allahu A'lam, right? The idea is that you should not put in public language these things, right? Because they could lead people astray. They could be misunderstood. And at this point, I have to stop and say something very central. Ibn Rushd, in defending the role and place in philosophy in the Islamic context, is not only responding to Abu Hamid, but he's also responding to the philosophers before, such as Al-Farabi and Ibn Sina, because he very much believes that Al-Farabi and Ibn Sina, in many of their works, also were putting forth conclusions that may be questionable or perhaps badly worded, perhaps, and they were being overly rational in some cases, so much so that they too have damaged philosophy. Damaged philosophy in two ways. Damaged it in actually putting forth not accurate conclusions, and also damaged it by inviting all this animosity to philosophy, right? Such as, when their claim, as you saw with Al-Ghazali, that the world is eternal, right? The world is co-eternal with God. Or, Al-Farabi's claim, for instance, in his book of letters, that philosophy precedes necessarily religion, and religion is nothing more than the figurative expression of the truths of philosophy, right? These kind of things stated publicly and openly and so damaged philosophy, both in the fact that they're kind of erroneous conclusions. If you're saying, this is Ibn Rushd, if you're saying you're following Aristotle, I don't think you fully understood Aristotle, says Ibn Rushd. And also erroneous in the fact that it's invited so much attack on philosophy and placed so much animosity between the Philosopher and the theologians and the traditionalists. Okay, sorry. So keep that in mind. His overall project is a rehabilitation and a defense of philosophy, not only against, Abu Hamid al-Ghazali or the Ash'arites or the traditionalists, but against anyone who may have done damage to it, either by misrepresenting it or by attacking it. So, from there he goes and puts down the following conclusion, or what he fully wants to push towards. The idea that, given all that has preceded, demonstrative reasoning or demonstrative study cannot and does not reach conclusions that contradict or conflict with revelation, right? For truth does not oppose truth, but accords with it and bears witness to it. Right? And this is a key moment in his text, which has been read in two different ways, and I'll place both ways before you and for you to debate and discuss. This notion of truth does not oppose truth has been read by some to suggest that Ibn Rushd has a theory of a duality of truth. The truth of revelation and the truth of philosophy. And the two do not oppose. Right? So the truth does not oppose truth, but accords with it and bears witness to it. Right? Another reading of this is that he's not talking about two truths. It's not really the truth of philosophy and the truth of revelation, but rather he's speaking about the truth attained through the path of philosophy and the truth revealed through revelation, which is the same, right? So it's not two truths, but it's one truth, one attained through philosophy, and the other already revealed. Does that make sense? Right? So it's actually the same truth, if you wish. And if we accept, and I think we have good reason to accept, that someone like Ibn Rushd and the many philosophers before him were very familiar with the Greek texts, though a number of them did not read Greek, but they were very familiar with the Greek texts. The Greek reference to truth is aletheia, which literally means, and I don't know if you can discuss this in your reading of Oedipus the King. You read Oedipus the King still, right? Yes, okay. So when he discovers the truths, right? Think of the word discover. Right? Something is covered, or you uncover, or you discover, right? And this notion of the truth is out there, if you're familiar with the X-Files, right? The truth is out there and you need to discover it. This is very much where the philosophical kind of methodology goes, right? The philosopher needs to unveil, is I think the best reference, to unveil truth. But this notion of unveiling is the same notion of revelation, kashf. Okay? So for someone who is so well grounded in philosophy and well grounded, obviously, in Islamic thought and Sharia and Kalam. The notion of truth understood as that which is revealed, either unveiled through the efforts and methods of the philosopher or unveiled by God himself, ought to be the same. There's only one truth. And so that's the other reading. But again, like I said, there are those who say, no, he's clearly speaking about two truths and they don't conflict. Right? So perhaps that's something to discuss. But it's very clear that in this statement, he's standing against what Al-Ghazali had said in the text you read, in Al-Munqidh min al-Dalal. Right? Because Al-Ghazali very explicitly says that the philosopher have three conclusions that clearly contradict religious revelation. Right? And here's Abu al-Walid now, Ibn Rushd saying, no, the truth of philosophy cannot contradict the truth of revelation. Again, I won't go into these details, but of course I invite you to read this closely. How does he defend? Because he defends these three accounts precisely, by the way. So in the text you're reading from Ibn Rushd, he will precisely respond to Al-Ghazali's attack on those three counts of unbelief, right? The eternality of the world, that God doesn't know particulars but only, that God doesn't know particulars but only universals, and that judgment applies, or resurrection applies only to the soul, not body and soul. So I invite you to read closely how he responds to it, and how Ibn Rushd will respond to these counts. And in doing so, keep in mind that in as much as he is responding to Al-Ghazali, he's somewhat responding to the philosophers as well. Because Ibn Rushd's aim is not to defend the philosopher, but to defend philosophy. And he admits very clearly that it is possible for the practitioner of philosophy or the student of philosophy to commit an error, of course. It is also possible for the practitioner of kalam to commit an error, or fiqh, jurisprudence, to commit an error, or medicine to commit an error. Does that mean the field itself has error in it? Does that mean we should ban medicine? Does that mean we should ban fiqh? Of course not. Right? So he's making an analogy on that level that, sure, there have been those who, through philosophy, have committed errors, but the error does not lie in philosophy, but maybe in their method and the person. Right? Okay. So from there, I will go to the final note I want to reference. So with all that, as I said, his main concern is rehabilitating philosophy, defending the place and role of philosophy in an Islamic world, and insisting on a centrality in a clear understanding of revelation. Again, all of that is in your text. I'm not going to go into the details. And he closes off with this tone of urgency and this tone of almost melancholy sometimes, I feel, which is the result of all this history, as I interluded very briefly at the beginning, of the various attitudes and attacks and debates and divisions, where he writes towards the end of the text, he says, "Our soul is in the utmost sorrow and pain by reason of the evil fancies and perverted beliefs which have infiltrated religion, and particularly such afflictions as have happened to it at the hands of people who claim an affinity with philosophy." Note that, right? Particularly by such afflictions as have happened to it at the hands of people who claim affinity to philosophy. Right? So many of those who work from within philosophy have injured religion. Injuries from people related to philosophy are the severest to religion. It, he goes on, i.e. religion, has also been hurt by a host of ignorant friends who claim an affinity with it. Right? So religion is, from Ibn Rushd's perspective, has been harmed from both directions, from those who claim to be its friends and defenders, and from those who claim to be of the path and method of philosophy. Right? And in this final statement, I think it comes out very clear that Ibn Rushd, the jurist and the philosopher, has as his utmost aim the defense of religion. In defending philosophy and defending the proper place and role of philosophy, he is essentially defending what he takes to be, and feel free to disagree with him, what he takes to be the proper path towards proper understanding of religion. So indirectly, perhaps even directly, in defending the place and role of philosophy, what Ibn Rushd is really doing is defending religion. And this harks back to a statement Al-Farabi actually said, which I'm not sure Ibn Rushd would disagree with. And Ibn Rushd says, Al-Farabi says, the relation of philosophy to religion is like the relation of the tool to the tool user, such that philosophy is the tool, and the religious faithful use that tool to the better understanding of their faith. Thank you for your attention.